is about that dataization of space, and in fact, the space-based dataization of the Earth. And I'm joined by a very distinguished panel who you probably see announced and who you will get to know as we go along. But I wanted to start off by asking you, Carissa, what distinguishes a space-based data business from an Earth-based data business?
Well, that's an excellent question, Oliver, and let me say that we hear a lot in the space industry about inspiration, and Earth as database. I think that's the new inspirational term that you've coined there. So the difference between a space-based data company and a terrestrial data company is that the space-based data company has an extraordinary opportunity. You've heard the saying at this point it's already hackneyed, data is the new oil. And a space-based company has the opportunity to create a vision, to create a data stream that is a vision of the Earth unlike any we've ever seen before. So think about the first time you were in an airplane and how that changed the way you perceived what you were looking at, the city or town that you were looking at, that you had driven through. Seeing it from a plane, you process it differently. You see activities happening simultaneously that you wouldn't think about necessarily in conjunction with one another. What satellite companies can do, what the new LEO satellite companies are seeking to do, is to, for the first time ever, have a picture of, have information about everything that is happening on the entire Earth at one time. That's extraordinary from a data standpoint. So the opportunity to create that data set or subsets or aspects of it, mine it, interpret it, and sell it, sell the knowledge that comes from it, that's what's different. The other thing that's different is the challenge, which is you've got to operate a space segment, which is more complex and more expensive and requires quite a different skill set than a typical terrestrial analytics company.
Yeah, I wanted to come on to you, Peter, to actually ask about that. It's your company, Spire. Maybe you can tell us first a little bit about what sort of data rates we're talking about when we talk about this as a data business.
Yeah, so the information that is collected and then the value that is extracted out of that information can vary by 3 orders of magnitude. Right? And so, for example, the information that satellites of Spire collect is 3D information sets of Earth. So the raw amount of data that is generated is literally gigabytes, and could be literally gigabytes per second. So it is unfeasible to have that amount of raw data being actually transferred back down to Earth. Now, what is helping us here is bringing Moore's Law and the capabilities of consumer electronics and mobile phones onto the space sphere, which allows us to compute out the valuable information from the raw data right onto the spacecraft and transport that down to Earth.
So you've had to build both. How big is the Spire constellation at the moment?
So it is literally, as of today, it is just 40 satellites, but ask me again in 6 weeks and it's going to be close to 70.
I think it's pretty cool that you can say just 40. I'm still new enough to this that kind of amazes me. What's more difficult for you as a company? Is it to build a constellation or to build a customer base?
Oh, it's a constellation. Right? I mean, like the need for information is incredibly high. You know, if you think about just the very, very moving video that was shown early on with Jeff Tarr from Digital Globe about human smuggling, that was a project done by Global Fishing Watch between Digital Globe, Spire, and Planet, right? The reason why we can make those changes now is because we can overlay some of the imagery data with the radio frequency-based data from Spire. So the customer demand is very, very high. It is like the capabilities at the right price point, which has been the challenge. And when Spire started out, the stuff that our satellites do were considered by conventional wisdom to be impossible. Like, we literally had to do things in secret and not tell anyone because people said, well, it's impossible, right? It's like this Bannister Mile moment that has happened in the last 12 miles where, for those that are not familiar with it, mankind for literally almost 2,000 years believed that you can't run a 4-minute mile, that the human body is just not capable of doing that. And then Richard Bannister, I believe in the 60s, ran a 4-minute mile, and within 6 weeks, 3 other people ran below a 4-minute mile because the mindset had changed. And I think that is partially what we are seeing today, is that the mindset of what is possible to do with small spacecraft has changed simply because people have done it.
Chad, I wanted to come to you on this. With that mindset change, how's that mindset change being reflected in the investment community?
I think it has, yeah. We're talking about data. The thing that's most striking to me is we're talking a lot about sensors, and we've got Spire up on here, and we've talked a lot about Planet Labs today. A lot of people gathering data, and we're thinking about where that demand is going to come from and who's going to use this data, and that's kind of the point of this panel. And to this point, I think we haven't, it always comes down to counting cars or some pretty basic things, but I think the issue that we run into is that the uses of data is so vast. It's kind of like when GPS was still a government-run program and, is there a commercial market for this thing? And you would ask somebody that, it's hard to answer that question because the possibilities are endless. So, coming up with specific examples, yeah, we can sit here all day, we can come up with those things, but I think it's the same in Earth observation and remote sensing. And so in terms of talking about the data and who's going to use the data and what's the commercial market for that and what's the investor interest in that, I think that we're still at that place. And there's something that's incredibly interesting that's happening right now is that we've got a lot of these new sensors in place. Peter's got just 40 satellites. And we're gathering a lot of new data. We've got images of the Earth, as we heard earlier, being gathered twice daily. This is new data sets that we've never seen before. Now, how do we get that into the hands of the people who are going to use it? And I think that that's the fundamental question here. And there's a distribution layer that is missing, I guess. And to date, I mean, when Planet Labs started just, a handful of years ago, and Peter, they had to build this thing from scratch. I mean, the entire value chain was done in a certain way for a certain customer since the beginning. And so the whole thing had to be reimagined, and there wasn't a partner or a supplier out there that could do these things for them, right? And so they came in and they ended up building the entire thing themselves. And today is a much different story. There's all kinds of, there's hundreds of companies who have raised equity financing and are out executing on their business plans. If you start a satellite company today, you would approach it in a much different way than you would have 5 years ago. And I think that that's really enabling, one, to get much broader distribution and get the data into the right hands of the people who are going to use it, and in a sense, actualizing this industry that we're talking about.
You were nodding very strongly there, Peter. What would you do differently today from what you did 5 years ago?
I would talk to this company called Spire, which allows me. I'm making like a joke here, but I mean, like it's a company that I know best, right? And so if someone comes to us, and people have come to us and have signed a contract with us I have a payload for a particular type of data, but I don't want to be bothered with this whole satellite and ground station things. And we say, yeah, there's a price, and in 6 months you're in orbit, right? I would have loved to do that, right? I mean, we had particular applications that we wanted to do where we had customers that said, we want to have the data. And then we realized we had to build this whole ecosystem that Chad was talking about. If I were to do it today, I would call up Peter and say, oh, this is my payload. I've seen your ICD. I want to buy launches, and I want to be up in 6 months. And I would say, great. Here's the team. Here's the ICD. Here's the contract, and off we go. And you can go from idea to orbit in 6 months for a literal fraction of the cost than what Will and Jason and I had to be doing to get to the data point.
Pete, I wanted to come up and maybe ask you slightly unfairly, to put on the black trunks and be the heavy for a moment here. There's an awful lot of other data that doesn't come from satellites, and a lot of it's data that's already comes very focused from things that people are doing that are commercially important, like buying stuff. And we're endlessly told, indeed at other Economist conferences, about the glories of the Internet of Things, which will be data to the nth data power. Mm-hmm. Is space really that special as a source of data?
Well, it's a fascinating question, and thanks, of course, for inviting us here to talk about this. For our company, we're gathering data from all sources of sensors, whether they're in the sky, in the water, on the ground. We do it for institutions, we do it for commercial entities, and to date, that's been sufficient for the types of missions that those customers are performing. What we're finding, though, is more and more our customers want to see fusion of all those data sets for more specific answers that have a higher degree of reliability for their sort of zero risk type missions. Typically, our customers are extremely regulated or military type customers. So there's really not much room for failure in providing a good analysis. And so while space is providing a whole new data set that can increase the fidelity of the decision making, we tend to believe that it's going to become a very important data set, but even more important when it's fused with the data sets that you're gathering from not just the Internet of Things, but traditional sensors that are already out there, doing things, particularly for these highly regulated customers, every day. And it's because of the evolutions that we've had in the computing power, and of course now the hardware, that is enabling all of this to come together and really provide insights that I don't think any of us thought were possible even a year ago.
I remember it was about a year ago, I saw an extraordinary demo at Black Sky where they were suggesting how they would target satellites autonomously on Twitter activity.
Yeah.
If you know the Twitter activity is coming from right there in this city, let's just go and look at that
absolutely.
Right now.
Yeah, well, as you know, we're actually pretty interested in that use case as well with Black Sky, so it's a good thing.
So, if all this is possible, where's the right place in the business to be? Do you want to be turning the tap of the hose, or do you want to be distributing the water to the drinkers? At the moment, it seems to me people are still people want to be all the way along the value chain, from building the satellites to selling the data to selling the value added. But in the long run, is that the way that the business works out, or does the business work out that in fact the real value added is in the melding and the interpretation, and data is just something that you rely on the world to provide you? Which way do you see that going, Carissa?
Well, that is an excellent question. I think that there's certainly simplicity in not having to own a space segment. But let's think about that model of the Internet of Things. How is my company, if I'm a data analytics company, differentiated from your company? It really comes down to your ability strategically, your ability to have unique capabilities, and often, and the current sort of strategic thinking is that constitutes a unique data set, and how do you acquire that unique data set? Building and deploying a satellite system is a very crisp way to do that. And so I think that the answer to the question really hinges on the extent to which the emergent Internet of Things provides broad shared access to data sets, or increasingly segmented access to data sets. And to the extent that access is shared, then having a unique resource like a satellite system that sees the entire globe really could be a significant differentiator from a business standpoint.
And which of those two things creates more? There's always the challenge of discerning between what creates the most overall value and what creates the most value that you can actually keep to yourself.
So you've got to own, in my view, you've got to have an extremely high, you don't necessarily have to own the customer, although from a strategic standpoint, I think it's preferable. But you have to have very high confidence that you can get to that customer, and your access to that customer can't be cut off by your partners and can't be disrupted by others. So you make money by selling the end product, and the space industry has, throughout its history, struggled with businesses that were established to create a space sector, to create a space segment, because that was of interest, that was technologically exciting, that was engaging for the founders and kind of if there is a new space age, I think the new space age is that many of those decisions are now being driven by financial considerations as opposed to technological considerations.
Chad, is that a change for the investment mindset to be looking not just at the space sector, but looking at the whole value proposition?
Yeah, there's a difference between wanting to hold it all to yourself, right, which is natural. There's an opportunity in this market, and I want to go out and get it all, and I'm going to pick up whatever pieces I can. But there's also a lot of value to what we're seeing today, which is the specialization, right? Of, okay, you go and do this thing, and I'll focus on the thing that I do best. You focus on the thing that you do best, and we'll work together. And in doing so, we can reach out to a broader market, increase the pie. There's a bigger pie for us to share. We all get a smaller percentage, but we all make more money in the end. And I think that that's what's happening. And this is not unique to space. This is innovation in action. This is, you see this in every new industry. Again, I mean, SpaceX is a famous example of being vertically integrated, but did they start off vertically integrated? No, they went out and talked to vendors and they said, that's really the way that you're doing this? We can do that better, faster, cheaper, quality, schedule, cost, all the things on our, these are our requirements, and if you can't do that, then I guess we got to do it ourselves. And it's the same with all of the other satellite companies that we've been talking about. So I just think that we're in a really great place, another inflection point in the industry where we finally matured to a point where there's hundreds of companies working together and you don't have to do it all yourself. And there's value in that.
So does that mean that effectively what you're doing is bringing space down to earth in a second sense, and that you're making the space business very like other information businesses, to go back to that original question to Carissa?
Well, this is, yeah, I mean, we're living in innovation S-curve, that you learn about in business school. We've seen them many times before in many other industries. It's just super exciting because we're doing it in space.
Peter, how do you feel about the questions, it's like how you keep that unique access to the customer, about where you add the most value?
Yeah, so there was a venture capitalist who very early on, I think almost 5 years ago, talked with us, and he says, Peter, we only invest in monopolies. I'm from Austria, right? So that kind of like really rubbed me the wrong way. But there is a truth to that question that I think Chad said. What is the value that accrues to like an individual? What is versus the value that accrues to humanity, so to speak, right? And when I look at the value chain pieces, right? If I am, let's say, only in the picks and shovel business, right? That can be a very daunting kind of like subset of the value chain where you basically have to be Walmart. Scale is going to become everything, and you really have to dominate that segment. If on the other hand, you are on the data analytics side, that is pretty darn scary as well because you don't control your input, right? And I find it genuinely quite daunting to try to compete in the machine learning or AI business with Google on anything, right? They're just going to look, and then at some point they're going to say, either I'm going to buy you or I'm just going to do it myself. And I think that build versus buy decision is going quicker and quicker towards build because of the internal access and resources that they have. So the approach that we took is like we need to control our destiny. Right? And I think the huge advantage of space data versus terrestrial data is that it's hard. So it is hard to get there in the first place, but once you have a huge barrier to entry, right? And that allows you to control the key ingredient of your data set that goes into your data analytics. And so, someone even with unlimited resources can't just, compete with you because they don't have the data. So I consider actually controlling that value chain from a sustainable competitive advantage perspective to be quite important.
I feel there's a slight tension between that answer and your earlier answer about how much easier it is now than 5 years ago, because now someone who wants to get a new source of data on orbit phones up Peter and Peter says, yeah, we'll do that in 6 months.
Well, that is true for people that want to use my platform, which is why I built it this way, right? So I can be the AWS, right? And so in a sense, if I'm the AWS of space, then I'm happy for Dropbox and Box fighting it out because both of them are sitting on my platform, right? And I just make twice the money, right? So in that perspective, now that I've built this conveyor belt to space, I'm happy for people, making it easier for people and competing more, because it's going to create more participation. It's going to grow the ecosystem, and I'm just going to take my Amazon slice of the pie.
It's interesting you bring up AWS. I was very struck by Steve's remark earlier that the important question for venture capitalists is why now? And I wondered, actually, I'd just very quickly run down the line from Chad back towards me. Just very quick answer. Why now? Why is this happening now? Is it data systems? Is it the cloud? Is it launch? Why is it now?
Access. We like to call 2009 the dawn of the entrepreneurial space age, because that's when the barriers to entry came down. This wasn't us selecting randomly a time out of air. It was, out of thin air. It was us looking at the data and saying, when did we have this? I was going to say explosion. This trend, this growth of new companies. When did all of this start? And it all comes down to 2009. And there was a lot of things that played into that. But the real barriers to entry came down when the cost of launch came down and pricing became transparent. And it opened the kimono. It brought down the curtain. All of a sudden, you knew how much it cost to get to space. And now there was competition.
Pete, now. Why now?
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of what he just said, and then just add that, as I mentioned earlier, the rapid advances in computational power over the last 5 years have made it possible to really drive the insights out of space that we couldn't do before. And you take that together with the rapidly decreasing cost to actually put things into orbit, bring those two pieces together, and you have this fuel, rocket fuel, if you want to call it, for this space race.
Peter, now.
There are three forces that I think have converged. Number one, standard. Number two, the iPhone, and number three, billionaires. Right? If you look at the transformation that happened on the shipping industry once the shipping container was invented, it is massive. Right? In 1999, 2000, the shipping container for space was invented. That standard got widely adopted sometime around the time frame that Chad mentioned. In 2007, the iPhone was presented and has cost literally trillions of dollars of investment in R&D, driving down the cost of components, increasing computational capabilities. And thirdly, we had the entrance of individuals in their early 30s with more money than God and a burning desire to leave a legacy. Right? And mankind has always striven to go beyond, right? And we actually once calculated the cost of the Santa Maria exhibitions to find America is about the same cost as conquering Mars on the GDP per capita basis. And so those three components, I believe, are converged, and they created it now.
Carissa, why is your now?
We did a study called Startup Space 2 years ago. We updated each year. And we looked at this very question, and I would say, and I'll echo a number of the comments here, that venture capital in space is really the precipitating difference, and that has been enabled by, one, billionaires with a legacy interest who have also a history of business success. So as Steve Jurvetson said earlier, that really did legitimize space as an investment. Two, reducing costs, particularly small satellite form factors, puts space ventures in the realm of the size of a typical venture investment. It's not multiple billions to start with, but it's tens of millions. That's very different. And the third critical piece is that data markets created the upside that attracts venture capital. So it's not just that the cost is appropriate, that the enterprise is appropriately sized, but that there's an opportunity for 10 or 100 times returns associated with unique data sets and the analytics that go with them.
So that's a wonderful sense of now. So the obvious next question is, what next? And particularly, what sorts of data are we currently not capturing that we want to capture of all the wonderful photons and other things that the Earth sends out into the universe, or indeed some photons we might send back? What are the next data sources that you want to see explored by this sort of technology? Pete, why don't you?
Wow, well, that's a big question.
Oh, good.
No, I mean, look, so I come back to the starting point is what can we do with all that data? And of course, that's where the deep learning science gets involved here. we're capturing, and I'll come back to another earlier question, which is the fusion of all the various different data sets. So I think in space right now, of course, there's stuff like what Spire is working on, which is the RF data set. That's very interesting. Of course, all of the imagery data is very interesting. But then I think it's more important when we start marrying that with atmospheric data that might not necessarily come from stuff in space. And other forms of data that are coming out of, like I said earlier, the water or on the Earth. And the types of insights that we're going to get out of that data will help us predict events that have profound impact on society. And these are both man-made or naturally caused events. And that's kind of where we're starting to think about is how do we actually get ahead of catastrophic things that the world never has thought about getting ahead of. And to do that, you're going to need all these various forms of data, including all the stuff that we collect today, and perhaps others that I don't think we've even thought about yet.
Chad, when you're fluttering around with your angelic wings, looking for places to bless with your beneficence, what whispers do you hear coming up from the people? What are they saying that they want to build and they want you to pay for?
It's really about distribution. The distribution is what's going to enable this future that we see where remote sensing and all this data is actually ingrained in everything we do in our lives on a much grander scale. If you've got the individual company and they're hosting their own data and they're doing their own AWS, that's great. And that helps with the distribution and allows them to get their distribution out. But all these different companies are generating different data, and it doesn't really talk to each other. There's an opportunity to bring all of that information together, to be agnostic to where that data comes from, and to be the distributor of that data. And I think that there's a big opportunity for that to happen. And I think that that's going to be a key enabler of where we've been and where we're going. I've seen a number of these types of companies pop up, and they have a very cool platform. And the problem is that they're usually bought up very quickly by corporate development arms or companies that are, again, looking to eat the whole pie themselves, which is, fair play. But I think that the company that has the appetite and the will to make that thing happen is definitely one of those things. I mean, staying in the data vein.
And does achieving that then create more space for instance, radar data or hyperspectral data?
That's the whole idea, right? Is that this satellite constellation is collecting optical at something. This satellite constellation is developing radar data and bringing all of that together to be able to fulfill the end customer's order, whatever it is. That's the key thing, is to be able to say, to convince a customer to come to the table in the first place, a big industry player or something, to say, you should really use satellite data in your business, and here's a great idea for how to do that. Okay, I'm listening. Okay, well, how about you show me how I can get this thing? And they're like, oh, well, we don't really have that data, Okay, well, fine, show me this thing. Well, we don't have that data either, but here's what we can show you. That's not what I want, right? It's about providing that solution to the end customer that when a customer wants something, there's an answer there.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, let's find out what our customers want today. So I'm going to, yes, I see what you all mean. Considering that Carolyn Porco can take pictures of Saturn with 1% of solar illumination, I'm not quite sure why we need lights this bright to pick us up for the cameras, but maybe it helps to have a $5 billion spacecraft doing it. I don't know. Anyway, some questions for our panel. Can I see any hands or indeed anything from the app? Am I being blind or are you being shy? Okay, there we go.
So it's Bill Diamond again from the SETI Institute. One of the problems we have today with the information age on steroids is, the signal-to-noise ratio is really bad. I mean, there's more data being generated on a daily basis, whether it's space-related or of any other kind. So what can we do to, data distribution, if the data isn't interesting, isn't very helpful. So what do we do to make sure that the data that we distribute, the data that we process, is in fact the most meaningful and valuable data? How can we screen or pre-filter data so that the signal-to-noise ratio is better?
Who would like to take that on?
Sure.
Go on.
I mean, so two parts of that question. One is we don't really know what we want until we want it, and then we want the history. So then we want to go back and see, how it changed over time. So it's tough to tell, especially in all cases. But I think something that's super interesting is you've got to, generally when you want remote sensing data or any data it's about something, right? I'm a mining company and I've got mines in key areas and I want to know what's happening there. I'm a shipping company and I want to know what's happening with my ships. Persistent surveillance is a solution to that, and I think a really good one. And there's companies that are doing things, combinations of data sets, right? One is to do this with high altitude balloons, right? And just park it over an area of interest and keep it there for a while. So that's not going to answer your whole question, but that's just like my take on a nibble on it, yeah.
Did you want to?
I do want to comment on that. I think the answer to that question for the space industry is not figure out the solution. I think the answer to that question for the space industry is try to keep up. What is going to drive the delivery of data analytics to a broad base of customers? What is going to drive the transformation of massive data sets into useful information is not, frankly, the space industry. The space industry is swamped by the size of the global analytics industry. And so in that one, I think that the strategy is to keep up and figure out how to keep the advantages of the space data set alive and feeding your company.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. So I think it's obvious that the amount of data that we collect from both terrestrial and space-based assets is going to continue to grow. So we're going to have tons of it. The answer, in my opinion, lies in having the domain expertise to be able to understand what data do I want to use and why. And that becomes a critical differentiator in this whole game. So if you're thinking about where is sustainable competitive differentiation created in space or in other businesses, it's by actually understanding the domain in which you're operating. And so how does this ecosystem in space work together? That's where, if I understand my domain, I can understand that I can get a cue from a space-based asset, which will enable me to collect data from another space-based asset that is more pertinent to the problem I'm trying to solve. And then, because I understand my domain, I can at least start to filter out some of that noise and collect the right types of data that allow my data scientists to do the real heavy lifting of driving the insight I'm trying to find.
I'm really interested, Peter, in the fact that you have this wonderful ability to take up climate data, where by definition it's all interesting because the models need the data, whether the data's got whatever the data says. Is that a model that can be broadened out? I mean, how much is climate data part of your business at the moment?
So when you asked before, what are like other data sets, right? I thought of a few examples that we see. And one realm that we see is actually one where I spend a lot of time thinking about because it is almost public good-like data, right? The huge advantage of satellites are that they cover all of the globe, right? They are truly borderless, right? When we look at the current systems of governance, right, democracy and capitalism, there is stuff that falls through the cracks. And climate data is one of them. Right? There is another data set that we have which could actually predict earthquakes. Right? And the question is like, okay, there is data which has value as economists would write their PhDs on, right? But people on Wall Street would not care about, right? So you got this gap between the economists and Wall Street. And climate data is another sense of that data. We spoke recently with the state of California about like that barrier to creating products in the climate realm and how can we leverage products that we create in the weather realm, right? Where weather forecast next 72 hours is of huge importance to a large number of businesses, and maybe we can just try to skim off the top some things that are in the climate realm, right? I mean, Spire could create quite easily a global observation system for atomic explosions, right? I hear that's of some political interest right now, testing those things, right? So you have those common good applications that are quite easy to do from satellites, but it's unclear about the market, right? And how can we fix those market failures for those data sets, and maybe use data sets which have direct applications. So one of the data sets that we see is a replication of mankind's history in science, where whenever we got access to a new force, electricity, magnetism, vacuum, nanomaterials, there was a huge explosion that you can see in invention, right? And with repeatable, almost conveyor belt access to zero gravity, you could see that now there is again a new physics environment, zero gravity, which can drive things from material sciences to pharmaceutical, right? And so again, maybe that's a way to have both externalities in the sense of better healthcare in the form of better drugs or better materials for mankind, but it can actually be financed by market because individual companies can capture the rent of it.
Question from over there, I think. Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm Sadia Pekkanen from the University of Washington. I have a question for all the panelists. I'm interested in the paying customers for your end products. And with that in mind, I'm interested in hearing your views about the balance between governments and commercial actors in buying the end products. Specifically, I'm interested in the use by governments and militaries of the kinds of products that you have created in the maritime domain awareness area in MDA that is bringing together small satellites, big data, and machine learning. Thank you.
Well, that was to everyone, but let's start off with Pete.
Well, MDA is very important to all of our customers. As you might imagine, if you can track any vessel as it moves around the world in real time, that becomes a pretty important data set for a lot of state actors, and frankly, a scary data set, actually. Nevertheless, all of our customers, our institutional customers, are really interested in that.
Scary how?
Well, there are some folks you just don't want to have, you don't want to have that data. And so that's where it becomes an important aspect of business to think about how you create those data sets and share them. Look, we're all in a global economy and we have global customers, and we're in the business of creating shareholder value. So you're going to sell product where you can do that, but then there comes a moral responsibility as well. And I think all of us share that moral responsibility. We're all ethical companies. Certainly in the global aerospace and defense industry, there's a fairly well understood balance of where you can share goods and services. But to answer your question, the MDA data set is, for our customers, which are both institutional and commercial, it's very important for all of them. And so I think we're going to see continued investment in that space.
Peter?
I would say 80% commercial, 20% government. They have different use cases for the data set. So I'm not sure. Other than that, I can't. I mean, they're almost identical from like how we interact with them, in the sense that they're a customer. You try and understand what is the use case, and then you see if the data source that you have, or more and more importantly, as Pete I think very rightfully said, what combination of data sources is going to best serve their need. And either you have that information yourself, like for example in Spire, weather information plus shipping information helps for better route planning, right? So you have a combined data set, or as we saw earlier, combination of imagery data and ship tracking data. So which combination of data sets, which partnership answers the question for the customer the best?
Okay, I'm going to I'll try and get one last question because we're running out of time. Yes, please.
I'll speak loudly until the microphone gets here. So as one of the data aggregation companies, my name is Melanie from Descartes Labs, one of the things that we're most interested in this large data volume is new business models. So currently, pixels are expensive. Thank you. Pixels are expensive. Are you going to move to new business models where they're more about renting versus owning so that we can use more of the data? And if we look at why have we had so many new data analytic companies, it's the release of this free data from NASA and ESA. If the commoditization of space is inevitable, will you be going to these new business models?
Okay, we have about a minute to go with that, and that could have been a whole new session. But that question about free data and about renting pixels, and I suppose free data is pixels which you can rent for nothing. How much of a model is that? Anyone?
Well, look, so I'll jump on the grenade.
Good man.
Thank you. It's a military background. I got to do it. But well, short answer is yes. Can I stop there? No. Bummer. No, short answer is yes. Value-added services is where everything's going. And the customer, in fact, is moving very, very quickly to give me an answer and moreover, not just an answer, but tell me what's going to happen after you give me the answer, and tell me what I should do about the answer. So that is out here, and everything we've talked about in terms of hardware and data analytics and launch to get to that is sort of forgotten. So for folks like us, that's a pretty interesting problem. And so I come back to my short answer. Yes. What do we do about it? That's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, I'm going to give Carissa the last word.
Very quickly, there is no such thing, we all know when we think about it, as the space industry. There is the data analytics, remote sensing piece of the industry. There's the telecom piece of the industry. There are emerging kinds of sensors. There's launch. So there is, and my company advises companies and government agencies across those areas. So I can tell you there is absolutely no single answer to that. Each of those segments has different dynamics and is going to move along that pathway at a very different speed.
Thank you, and I think that's actually the message that I take away from the whole discussion, is that this has become an extremely rich, variegated system. And we use the word ecosystem lightly to some extent, but it's always got to be remembered an ecosystem is not holistic. It's not there for any purpose other than it's what you get when you put those creatures there. And that's what they do. That's how they pass information and energy around. That's what makes an ecosystem. And I think you've sketched out a very interesting picture of an emerging one. Thank you very much indeed.